Oops, I went forward one. Hi, everybody. I think we are live streaming now. Welcome. Oops, let me go back one slide. Welcome to the first of the CTIS Master Series sessions that we'll be holding over the next couple of months. This is a general introduction to CTIS and some thoughts that you may have for getting ready for CTIS, or some food for thought maybe is the better thing. I am Francine Lane. I am the Senior Director of Product Management and and the VP of Global Transparency here at TrialScope Informa. And Thomas?
Yeah, I'm Thomas Wicks. I'm the Head of Data and Partnerships at Pharma Intelligence. And I also lead the disclosure advisory services within the TrialScope group of Informa. So with that, let me maybe just talk about the agenda today. What we're going to cover is just to give a high-level overview of what the EU clinical trial regulations and CTIS are and what they mean and how they differ. Talk a little bit about the difference between the EU clinical trial regulations and the directive that has been in effect until the beginning of this year. And we'll cover a few additional items, such as having to do with the scope of data sharing and some other questions that come up. This is based largely on the questions that Francine and I often get from companies that we work with or that we hear through other venues. And so we hope this is going to be a useful approach to bring together some of those thoughts and ideas. So Francine, if we could page next.
I can try. Oh, no, too far. There we are. So, Thomas, do you think you can give us a little overview of what is the EU CTR and CTIS?
Sure. So the EU CTR, by the way, this is very confusing because until January of this year, EU CTR is also the abbreviation for the EU Clinical Trial Register, which is the front end of UDRA-CT that the public uses. But in this case, and I think more commonly these days, the EU CTR is the EU Clinical Trial Regulations that came into effect in 2014, but didn't come into application until January 31 of this year. And it's intended to simplify conducting multinational clinical trials, well, multinational within the European Union context, by requiring just a single submission via the new CTIS portal of a clinical trial application and other documents, and really sort of centralizing that process. So you're dealing with more or less one entity than with 26 entities. You get a single assessment procedure leading to a single decision. And it went into force, as I said, in 2014, but came into application this year when the Clinical Trial Information System, or CTIS, went live. So after a few years of development, that's live now. So what is the Clinical Trial Information System? In essence, it's a replacement for the UDRA-CT portal that has been available since the May of 2004 for submitting clinical trial applications to local competent authorities in Europe. CTIS is a central submission and communications portal for all these clinical trial applications, as well as additional documents that we'll cover quite extensively today. It's also a portal for reporting and the supervision of clinical trials, including submission of safety reports and clinical trial results. So you'll see a little bit more around that later on today. And as we said already, it went live a few days ago. And so, Francine, I want to turn it over to you. CTIS has been in development for a while, but what is the implementation timeline for CTIS and the EU clinical trial regulations that cover trials?
Yeah, this is the big question at the moment. So if you look at the timeline of putting CTIS into production and the application of the regulation, it really started last July when the decision was put in the official journal of the European Union that CTIS was ready to go. So there was that started the 6-month timer, and that 6-month timer ended on January 31st of 2022 with CTIS going into production. And as Thomas mentioned, that was the time where the regulation goes into application. So that happened at the end of January of this year. For the next year, so until January 31st, 2023, sponsors have the option of authorizing new trials either through the process of the directive in UDRA-CT or using the new CTIS system and being under the governance of the regulation. After January 31st, 2023, or on or after, I would say, all new trials must be authorized using the under the governance of the regulation and using the new CTIS system. So for the next year, you can pilot and try out the new system, but you can still continue to authorize your studies under the existing process. But after January, the end of January next year, you must authorize all new trials in CTIS. There is a 3-year transition period between January of this year and January 2025, where ongoing studies can continue to run on via UDRA-CT under the directive. So that means all the activities of your trial can continue under UDRA-CT. So you will send your major modifications through your national competent authority, do all your communications through the national competent authorities, and even your results will be due in UDRA-CT as long as your study ends before January 2025. At that time, any ongoing studies need to be transitioned into the regulation in CTIS. Whoop, sorry. Let me go here. So, Thomas, can you give some ideas on how the new EU CTR, the new regulation, compares to the old directive?
Yes, of course. So we thought one way to learn, at least for me, was is kind of visually comparing, contrasting old and new, so we can see the differences. So when we think about what we all know fairly well, what we're deeply experienced with on the UDRA-CT system under the clinical trial directive, you submitted a clinical trial application through the UDRA-CT system and sought approval through each country's regulatory authority individually. So you would have multiple CTAs being submitted and processed. The new CTIS system under the EU clinical trial regulations, on the other hand, you submit a single CTA through the CTIS for all member states concerned, which includes the ethical and scientific evaluation. So all of that's done through this central procedure.
Sorry.
Yep. And then the next step is you have to submit an application in the old system to seek approval from each country's ethics committee individually. You don't need to do that anymore now. If you use CTIS, there's no need for a separate local ethics committee applications and opinions. So that kind of gets you to the next step. Then when we look at the communications regarding submissions, it's really specific to each country. So you're communicating with each health authority separately under the current system. And in future, you really should be receiving communications only through CTIS, the platform, and vice versa. Though we have heard already a couple of health authorities saying, yes, but we'd also like to have some other advice. Don't know how long that's going to take to fully transition until everyone, including the health authorities, are comfortable that CTIS is truly the only way. But if you hear anything, it would be interesting for us to know if you are still getting separate communications, even if you're using the CTIS system.
Yeah, Thomas, one little anecdote.
Please, yeah.
From the DIA call earlier this week, we had a representative from the EMA join, and at least one health authority is saying, if you want us to be your reporting member state, please let us know that in advance. So they actually want the communication outside of CTIS so that they can be prepared to be the reporting member state. So this thought that all the communications will go through CTIS is maybe not reality at the very beginning, at least.
Yeah, I'm sure there's a transition period until those kind of additional communications are considered and processed and standardized. Speaking of, when we talk about the current system, the assessment procedures and deadlines can vary a little bit from country to country. And the other aspect, we sort of combine two elements, is that currently you can also submit multiple amendments kind of concurrently and add trial sites or countries at any time. So if if you're running a CTA in UDRCT and you decide, oh, we're going to add some sites in Germany, we're going to start running the trial in Germany, you can do that at any time. In the CTIS system, everything has to be done sequentially. So there are no amendments that you're doing concurrently. One has to be finished through the processing before the next one can be submitted. So just something to keep in mind as you're preparing to submit your CTAs, that has to be managed carefully, that entire process. Yeah, so with that, we'll go to the next one, which is the timing of responses for information can vary across member states in the current system. Going forward, if you have an RFI, so a request for information, you must respond within 12 calendar days or risk lapsing of the application and having to do many steps over again. And then finally, the current system does not require a plain language synopsis of the protocol or a plain language summary of results under the directive. Under the regulation, you must provide a plain language synopsis of the protocol when you submit your CTA. And when you submit your results, those have to be accompanied by a plain language summary of the results.
Can you keep going on with that and tell us how requirements for trials submitted through the processes are changing?
Sure. So if we think about trials that were submitted under the directive, so these are all the trials that you've submitted through the UDRCT system. What happens going forward? We get questions of, well, what if the trial ends in 2024? Do I have to do a plain language summary for that trial that was registered on UDRCT? So if you think about it, there's two paths that a study can take. So if you have a study on UDRCT, which you can submit a CTA through January of next year, 2023, provided that trial ends before January 2025, it doesn't have to transition. So that's that blue column on the left, or the teal. I'm not good with colors, but anyway. So if the trial was authorized under the directive and it completed before January 2025, then summary results are done through the UDRCT systems. Plain language summaries of results are not required. Phase 1 studies are not made public unless they have pediatric participants or a part of a pediatric investigation plan. And all the redacted documents are due when the product is approved in alignment with policy 70 or 43. However, if that same study continues beyond January of 2025, it must be transitioned to CTIS, which means it also then comes under the requirements of the EU trials regulations. That means a summary of results must be submitted, though you through CTIS. At the moment, there isn't really a defined format for that yet. There's defined requirements, but no format. And what most sponsors are suggesting, or many sponsors are suggesting, and we recommend as a best practice, is for now at least use the format of the UDRCT results and spin that off into a PDF file that you can upload. That seems to be the cleanest and touches on most of those requirements. A plain language summary will be due, and results for all phases will be made public, though there are options to delay that. One reminder is you must request those delays when you submit the CTA. And I'm not exactly sure what happens with transition studies because you're not submitting the CTA at the very beginning, Francine, unless you want to talk about that reauthorization process.
I can talk a little bit about it, and that's actually a question that's coming up in the chat, is how do you transition a study from UDRCT to CTIS? As I understand it, and I'm putting that giant caveat here because I think there's still a lot to be discussed and decided in how the process will actually work. But as I understand it, what is required in CTIS is what is required in CTIS, and their process is that you authorize a trial and go through all of those stages. So for trials that are transitioned into CTIS, that process must still hold true. You will need to get your trial reauthorized under CTIS, but that it might be slightly abbreviated in that they know that they've already gone through the whole process of authorizing it through UDRA-CT and the national competent authorities, but those steps still need to be done. So there will be a reauthorization process, and at that time, I presume there will also be the opportunity to request a deferral of publishing some of this data or making some of this information public at that time. It's a very good question. I don't think we have all of the answers to that yet. But there will indeed be a reauthorization process, and we would presume that there's some alignment between a new study and a reauthorized study at some level.
Well, the good news is that we still have a few years before that becomes reality. So those questions will no doubt be answered in the coming months. But it's one of those watch this space, because you may need to do some planning. And I would say, as just a general rule, for all your clinical documents, just understand that eventually virtually everything will be made public. So really do consider the redaction and anonymization requirements at the time of authoring the documents, because they will be public. And there's a whole separate presentation series on how to do that. So I'm not going to delve into that today, but just as a thought, really keep that front of mind in your process, and maybe start putting that into your templates and your authoring SOPs and reviews. So Francine, I'd like to switch over. We do get questions quite often, like, okay, I'm getting confused. What's the difference between the European Medicines Agency, the European Commission, and the member states? What are they responsible for?
Excellent question. So the European Union, or the member states within the European Union, or quite technically the European Economic Area, because it also includes Liechtenstein and Iceland, they're responsible for using CTIS, interacting with the study sponsors, applying the regulation and the interpretation of that regulation. But they still have some of their own individual country laws that they have to work with. So they need to figure out how to harmonize those requirements with their local requirements and templates. Their ultimate responsibility is to either authorize or reject the trials. The European Medicines Agency, who is very much the point that's in the spotlight at the moment, they're responsible for the clinical trial information system. They're responsible for the technology that is being used in here. But a lot of the questions that we're getting are not really appropriate to submit to the EMA, because it's the European Commission who is responsible for interpreting that regulation. So when questions come up about is it okay to do this instead of that when you're submitting your summary results, for example? One of the questions that we get is it okay to use clinicaltrials.gov summary results? Because way back in the day, you could do for certain legacy studies, when results were first due on UDRA-CT, you could submit the clinicaltrials.gov version. It's not the EMA's area of responsibility to decide that. It's actually the European Commission. And because of this, these three bodies that are somewhat autonomous between each other but need to work together, the EMA has requested that any questions go through the FPA representative and the industry group FPA, because they're going to need to go through a collaborative evaluation with all of these three parties to get an official Q&A or FAQ to answer those questions. And I know it can be very frustrating because everybody wants to have the answers, but it's not just one group who's responsible for the answer. So they have a process to coordinate those questions and create the answers to those. Those Q&A documents are published on the EMA website, but it's not just their responsibility to get the answer. So that has been the request that came up rather recently that is useful to share, because I know I've heard a lot of frustration that the answers are not really coming. It's because it's a lot of people involved in making sure those answers are consistent across all of the areas, and they put official documentation out. How about Thomas? You talk to us about this new scope of disclosure and data sharing, because it's changing quite a bit.
Yeah, so thank you, Francine. For the studies that are submitted through the EU portal, what you'll see is there's a pretty large scope of data that are made public, documents that are made public at some point in the study's life cycle. And again, remember, there are options to defer some of these elements. And we'll have a grid at the end, which we won't dig through, but it's a resource. So when you get a copy of the presentation, if you request one, then you'll have that as a resource. And of course, the European Medicines Agency has a lot more detail on the deferrals. So we won't spend too much time on that today. But overall, what you're submitting is you're putting in the full dossiers being made publicly available. So the medicinal product dossier, safety and efficacy sections. The investigator brochure is put out into the public. The RFI notifications. So this is all of the information that flows between the sponsor responding to requests for information and trial notifications.
Yeah, this is not something to take lightly. These are the communications that you're putting within CTIS. The anticipation is that these will be made public at some point in time.
Yeah, I mean, essentially anything that CTIS, anything the health authorities use also to make decisions will be in the public space. That's sort of the philosophy behind it, that there's transparency in the decision making of the health authorities in terms of product approvals and trial approvals. Of course, results and plain language summaries will be made, result summaries and plain language summaries and synopses, all that will be made publicly available. The trial protocol will be put into the public space. Then the subject information leaflet or patient information sheet will be made public. Also, don't forget the full IMPD, except the quality section, will be in the public space. And then ultimately the characteristics of the main of the trial, the main characteristics of the trial. So you can see it's a very broad scope of disclosure. There's more detail to it. The purpose of this slide is to summarize things at a higher level, just to give you sort of a scope of that. But you can see it's a lot. And we found that where one regulator leads, others will follow. So I would not be surprised if this kind of scope of disclosure is emulated by others over time, whether it's Canada or the US eventually. But we can see a broadening of that. At very least, it's in Europe. So if you have any trials running there, this will affect you directly.
Yeah, and one thing to note that some of these documents that get uploaded into CTIS, you may be uploading two versions. One that is public facing with some redacted or data elements or sections that are not included, and one that is not made public for the regulators and the member states.
Yeah, good point. Thank you. So Francine, maybe also, we just talked about the scope of disclosure, but how about the frequency of disclosure? How often do I have to update my records? If you could talk to that.
Right, excellent question, because under EudraCT and the directive, when you're running a trial in Europe, there's not really an obligation to keep your study data updated. Of course, you need to submit substantial modifications to the member state or to the national competent authorities, and theoretically, they are supposed to publish that information on EudraCT to be made public. There's some inconsistency in timing and availability of those substantial amendments. But really, when you come down into the CTIS, it will behave much closer to the requirements for clinicaltrials.gov, that the information that is made public from CTIS will be kept current and up to date. So what this means is that there are certain notifications that need to be submitted to the member states when milestones are reached, for example. And these notifications in the left-hand side in the teal color have to be made within 15 days of the milestone being reached. So when a study starts enrolling in a member state, let's say your study starts enrolling in Germany, then you have 15 days to notify Germany that the study has started to enroll. If you're running that trial in 10 different countries, then you will have 10 different notifications that need to be made. This also needs to happen when the first patient first visit occurs, when the recruitment ends, when there is a temporary halt, when the trial resumes, and when the trial ends in a member state. In all the member states, which is, it looks like that's done indirectly by taking the latest in each member state, and when the global end of trial is reached. So all of these notifications must be submitted through the CTIS application to the member states within 15 days of the activity occurring. There are certain other things that you need to let the member states know within a shorter time period of 7 days, and that's if an urgent safety measure is taken, if you become aware of a serious breach, and if you become aware of a serious breach that relates to safety or the rights of patients or the reliability of data. So there are very strict timelines for these things, and especially when you're talking about the items in the purple on the right-hand side with a very short timeline for notification, those are often multi-departmental responses to a very big deal. And having it done within 7 days is going to be very, very challenging for many. So first of all, you need to make sure your systems and CROs are set up to collect this information quickly. Secondly, and we didn't put that on here, is if you don't have your policies and procedures documented on how you will handle these different scenarios, you should get them done, because you do not want to respond within a week of something if you don't have your instructions in place already. The big one. Can I defer disclosure of phase 1 trial information or other documents, Thomas?
Okay, so if you go to the next slide, we're going to spend the next 20 minutes reading this line by line. Actually, no, that would be a dreadful experience for everyone. I will say there is an updated Excel spreadsheet. I think it's an Excel spreadsheet, or a spreadsheet anyway, available on the European Medicines Agency's website. And I don't know if we have a link to that. I'll have to check. If it's not there now, we'll make it available to others. But this is summarized. I lifted this summary table from a colleague of ours in Pink Sheet who wrote this. I put it together very nicely. The way to think about it is much like on clinicaltrials.gov, where you can request a delay, let's say for a new indication or for a new product, or perhaps a good cause extension. You can do something similar in Europe. The timelines are fairly generous compared to what's possible in Europe for some of the documents, but they're broken down into different categories. And I think that's really an important part to think through. So category 1, in essence, phase 1 studies, right? So those are the ones that have the longest possible delays for some of the data, though it depends very much whether they are pediatric participants or whether the study is part of a PIP. Category 2 trials are your typical phase 2-3 studies where delays are possible, especially because the product is often unapproved or the indication, so it makes sense to have some ability to delay. Though, as you can see by the NAs, it's not possible for certain elements of it. And category 3 trials or phase 4 studies, which by definition are market-approved studies, products, so delays becomes much more limited. And you can see that you can delay certain things up to the point when you're doing results disclosure, but most of the things are not permitted. So I'm not going to go any deeper into that. I do want to point everyone to the attendees question option. We have a fair number of questions coming in, and we'll switch over to answering some of those or going through some of those in a bit. And I promise if we don't get to yours, please email me at thomas.wicks@informa.com. And we will process them that way, because we have a little bit limited time to go through all of them, and it's a good conversation. Mm-hmm. But with that, Francine, I think we'll move on to the next question. I think just to give that overview, which is, what are the requirements, Francine, for plain language summary and participant data? So protocol summaries and results data.
Right. So protocol plain language summaries or synopsis is a topic that, quite honestly, wasn't in the zeitgeist until very recently, I would say. And now a lot of attention is being paid to it. Plain language summaries of results have been discussed for years, but now, oh my God, we have to also do protocol. So this is a topic that it seems to be something that is very recent in everybody's view, and I think it's because people are getting ready to start submitting their requests through CTIS. the EMA, or actually all the bodies together, have started putting recommendations for the content of plain language protocol summaries. And that can be found in the latest question and answer document. I mentioned earlier that they put together a Q&A document. The latest one is version 5, I think, on the website, even though the website itself says version 4. When you open it up, it says version 5. But there is section 5.8, and the question is what should be included in the protocol synopsis described in Annex 1D24, and it does have a listing of the sections that should be included in your protocol summary. This is a fantastic document that you will go back to again and again as you're going through your process. Another area that has been on the radar a lot has been a few months ago, the EMA said no patient content, no patient data should be uploaded into CTIS. And that was okay until people started thinking about it. Well, you know, there are certain sections of the document that are pretty easy to not include in that. But when you're talking about a narrative, for example, or maybe even an adverse event, you will need to reference the specific coded patient information or participant information to give the regulators the information that they need to provide the context of that. And so it came up rather recently, and they took a stand on it also rather quickly to update this document, which is also another good document that you should have on your radar. The title of it is Questions and Answers on the Joint Controllership Arrangement and Data Protection Matters Related to the User of the Clinical Trial Information System. Yes, that is the whole title of the document. It is one that they will continue to update with guidance as well. But what they have updated in there is some language saying that it's possible to contain coded data for trial participants in the not for publication version of the document. Remember a little bit earlier, I said some of the documents have 2 versions that are uploaded, one that is for public and one that is for not. You will have to make sure that you don't include the coded data in the for public version, but the not for publication version can and should potentially have some of this information. So these are 2 areas that have been sort of hot topics of conversation over the last couple of weeks that we wanted to share with you the latest and greatest information.
And by the way, before we go on, I was looking at a couple of questions. I know we're coming to Q&A in a sec, but what is a plain language summary? So in essence, it is the simplest way to think about it, it's not 100% accurate, but it's a version of the results synopsis, like the ICHE3 synopsis, roughly, but containing only the information that would be relevant to a patient or a participant, and is non-promotional, of course, and is written in a way that could be understood by someone with an 8th grade education, so roughly 12 years old. And ideally, it's presented in all the languages of the informed consent of the participants of the trial. So I hope that just sort of provide a little context around that. And then just the last question.
There are several questions about plain language summaries here.
Yeah, I'm sure there are, and we're going to get to them in a sec, but just wanted to sort of, what are some of the other resources there?
Yes. So this is, I would say if there's one thing that you bookmark, it is the Clinical Trials Information System Training and Support page. You can search CTIS training in your search engine of choice, and you'll come up on this page here. There's a screenshot of it on the right. It has all of the training modules that the EMA has published. There's a handbook for clinical trial sponsors, which I highly recommend reading. There's reference materials. When Thomas was talking about an Excel document that talks about the specific information that can be deferred or not, that document is in there. Information on the Master Trainer Program, other training and information of it, everything can be found, I think, or almost everything can be found from this website. So it is a fantastic resource. They have really put a lot of time and effort to making this useful for everyone. And I highly, highly recommend that you visit it and bookmark it. One of the other things, if you are a subscriber to Pink Sheet, the Pink Sheet folks keep on top of this information very well and will keep you informed as well as things change.
Great.
And I think with that, we are ready for the Q&A.
Yep. Perfect. Thank you. So let me pick out a couple just to get the conversation started. Just two organizational questions that have come up. This webinar is being recorded. So when after the webinar, it'll be available for you. We can also make available a PDF of the presentation if you find it useful. And again, if you have any questions that don't get answered today or you want a little bit more follow-up, please do reach out to me. Again, it's thomas.wicks@informa.com. Actually, I think the next slide might have our contact information. If you would just want to put that up.
That actually would probably be more useful to show.
So just in case you have that, if you want to reach out to us, this is my LinkedIn connection. And then if you are interested in any of the other presentations that we've done recorded, or that we need to have a separate conversation around, principles around redaction or thoughts around plain language summaries. Again, we have quite a few presentations that support the CTIS rollout in different aspects, so we can get to those. So the first question I want to just touch on, Francine, if you could talk about, do the same regulations apply to medical device trials, and do these CTIS regulations apply to trials that started already in the past? I think we addressed the second part, but if you could talk about the other.
Yep. So there is a separate regulation for device. That's the EU-MPD, the medicinal product devices, maybe. I have drawn a blank on what MPD means at the moment. So there is a separate regulation for devices. The CTIS and the EMA in general cover drug trials. And so there's some combination trials that would be included in here that are combination device and drug, but CTIS is only applicable to drug trials by and large. And not strict device trials. And the second part of the question, which is, does CTIS apply to older trials? I'm going to wrap in the answer to another question with that as I tip on that. If your trial ends prior to the end of January 2025, and you don't transition it into CTIS, you just run it in UDRA-CT, that is perfectly fine. If your trial is going to last beyond the end of January 2025, then you must transition that trial into CTIS, and then the CTIS regulation and the requirements that are part of CTIS will then apply to that trial. How do you transition that trial? That's one of the other questions, and we touched on it a little bit. There will be a process to reauthorize the trial. This is as I understand it today. There will be a process to reauthorize the trial in CTIS, apparently a slightly abbreviated process, but you will have to go through that reauthorization trial to move it into CTIS. And we actually did just find out this week that now UDRA-CT will inform, will indicate on the public site if you have transitioned a trial from UDRA-CT into CTIS, so that the public knows where they can go to find results for those transition trials.
Thank you, Francine. I'm going to take the next question, and if while I'm talking, you can have a look at some other questions too.
Sure.
For yourself. One question I have here is around plain language summaries. It says that while I appreciate and understand the request for plain language protocols and results versions, it sounds easy, but in practice may be more difficult. Yes. We've worked with some sponsors. Once you have an experienced process, you've got the plain language templates, the plain language glossaries, an organization that understands and appreciates what it means to produce plain language artifacts, which automatically involves or requires presenting scientific information somewhat less precisely, just because people don't necessarily understand terms like myocardial infarct. They understand heart attack, even if those are not 100% the same. Thoughts like that. Like how do you bridge the gap between accuracy and and sort of readability, understandability for people who may have very little scientific education, or it's been a while since they were in high school. The result of that is that some companies end up spending a great deal of time writing their first PLS. The longest I heard was one company took 18 months. Now, it doesn't take that long to author the document. It is a specialist skill to write these, but the review and approval process within the organization, making sure that the clinical teams, the study physician, everyone is comfortable with the language, that the legal department agrees that it's not promotional because that's always a risk, et cetera, et cetera. It can take a great deal of time. To be conservative, I would recommend planning at least 12 months for your first one if you've never done it before. Over time, those become much faster and simpler because you'll just have a really snappy process. I also recommend the first few, you may want to bring in expert resources. We have some folks on staff, for example, but there's definitely other organizations that can help. But it's really useful to have someone on staff who's done these before. These are not like taking informed consent, because that's sometimes considered to be plain language, but let's face it, it rarely really is understood by someone with an 8th grade education. So yeah, take your time. Francine, did you pick a question?
Yes. Let me see if I can find it now. There are quite a few questions around redactions. And quite honestly, I am not qualified to answer those questions, nor is Thomas, but I believe the next session, actually in this series, we're going to be talking about transparency and some of the documents that need to be uploaded. So it's not in the scope of what we're covering in this session, but it will be in another session. Yeah. But the one that I was going to take, there was just a lot of redaction ones, is around how do you notify a member state ahead of your CTIS submission if you want them to be the reporting member state, for example. I actually asked this exact question of the representative from the EMA because it actually goes against everything that CTIS is supposed to do. But there should be standard, most of your regulatory groups already have contacts within the national competent authorities to talk to them. And it would be a similar process, as I understand it, at least temporarily, to go through that group and that process to reach out to the member states if you want them to be a reporting member state. If there's other conversations that they wish to have offline, that is not anything that I know officially about that, but I'm assuming that in most cases your regulatory group will have the contacts that they need to reach out to those member states.
Thanks, Francine. I will take one of the redaction questions.
Oh, fantastic.
Just because I've been talking a lot with organizations that do redact information and sort of around the best practices for that. A lot of it has to do with preparing your documents properly at the very beginning. The question here is, can you address the information that can be redacted in public-facing versions of the document? So it's all personally identifiable information and personal health information. So you're definitely anonymizing the information, preferably anonymizing than redacting, which is just black boxing the whole set, so that it doesn't look like, like you're suppressing too much information from the public view. That does mean ideally that you structure your documents properly. Let's say being very careful about where you include patient narratives, typically put those at the end, where you're using real titles from a company, just call someone a study lead instead of the specific organizational title. There's a lot around that. And as I said earlier, I've done a presentation for the American Medical Writers Association around preparing documents, both for plain language summary, disclosure, and for redaction. So we might turn that into a webinar in general, just as a follow-up to the next CTIS series. The other element that you can redact, but this is very lightly, I have to say, is company confidential information. Mm-hmm. So to give you a sense, one pharma company had under policy 70, a submission of their CSR, and it was, I don't know, like 150,000 pages or something like that. And a total of about 2 pages of CCI redactions were accepted. So it just gives you a sense that basically you're not going to be able to redact a lot, especially for approved products. Unapproved products, we haven't seen exactly how tough they're going to be with accepting CCI redactions for products where information has to be disclosed within 5 years, which might be ahead of market authorization. That's TBD. But with that, there's a few more questions. I'll see if we can follow up with the folks on the emails. I want to be mindful of time. So I hope you join us. I hope you found this useful. I hope you join us in next month when we pick up on this CTIS Master Series and delve a little bit more into the document submissions that you're making. So that is definitely going to be part of that, is going to be digging deeper into some of these elements around preparing the documents for submission, what that looks like. So I thank you all for attending. Please do reach out to me through LinkedIn if you want to connect, or as I said, email thomas.wicks@Informa. And thank you very much. Have a great day.
Thank you.